Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger potion.
So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for August 23rd, 2024, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody, as we begin our 2000 retrospective. We have been counting down the years. We'll get to best of the decade soon, but this week we are doing our 2000 retrospective. And as we always do with these retrospectives, we begin with a review, talking about one of the most defining films of the given year.
Yeah.
And then we'll be getting into our top 10 movies of 2000.
Yeah.
As we've done, though, since we reshifted the format here, the review, Almost Famous, we'll talk about it. That'll live here separately. And then on the main show, episode 599, coming out this week. Again, that'll be our top 10 movies of the year 2000.
How would you feel if I said I still had a lot of homework to do?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. That's why I begin this in all earnestness. I truly begin back in February. So I feel like I'm able to get to a lot.
I kind of did too, but Maris and I were post the glorious wedding phase, and we were just too focused on each other. So I'm gonna admit defeat on that one when it comes to my podcasting and film critic duties.
No, that's fine. I mean, you have these phases in your life. That's certainly one of them. Wait until you guys have kids. Things will.
I mean, there'll definitely be some new things there. Hey, but speaking of new phases, for anyone that actively watches us on YouTube, you may have noticed that there might be a slightly different background once again for me, because Maris and I are finally moving into our new house. We're getting things situated. So right now, the background is literally a cluster F right now, but keeping to the Almost Famous music theme, the bass guitar is finally back. So it's at least making an appearance once again.
Yeah, no, that's very exciting. We have to have the music theme for this specific review.
We do.
Especially.
And of course, being, a rock band that likes to, I guess, celebrate glorious excess in some way. Cheers. So I normally don't do this on a podcast, but I have to do it today.
Yeah, many people don't know this, but Brendan was actually the original bass player for Stillwater. Turns out. So
that would make me, wow, I guess that means I look really good for my age, if that's the case.
Yeah, for your age, you look great. Yeah.
Wow. The real life Benjamin Button right here.
Yeah, exactly. I'm very excited to dig into this film. Of course, written and directed by Cameron Crowe, which won the Oscar for screenplay that year as well. I'm curious not only to get into the review, we'll see if it ends up on our respective lists as we get to episode 599. But I do love doing these retrospectives. It's one of my favorite things we get to do each and every year. This year, compounded with our Best of the Decade awards coming very soon as well. With all of that laid out, let's go ahead and jump into Almost Famous.
All right.
As I noted, this is written and directed by Cameron Crowe. It stars Patrick Fugit, Billy Crudup, Frances McDormand, Kate Hudson, Jason Lee, Philip Seymour Hoffman, and I will say one of the more rewarding yet touching aspects of doing these retrospectives in the last 5 years or so is seeing Philip Seymour Hoffman in all of these movies that we watch. And it's incredible. This is one of his.
It's bittersweet. It's so bittersweet, but he's so good at this.
I know. It's like every time I see him, even when it's a film such as this that doesn't require emotion in an overt way, I still watch him pop up on the screen, and I can't help myself. It's like, man, I miss the guy so much. He was my
Philip
favorite.
Seymour Hoffman was also one of the funniest guys on the planet. He
Yeah.
really was. We often don't talk about a performance like Along Came Polly as
Oh
much
my
as we
gosh.
should. It's a
Yeah.
film that's a film that is not very good. But the character of Sandy Lyle is one of the great
He's
comedy
great.
characters of the past 20 years, if you ask me.
Absolutely. And we'll, of course, talk about him here, but you could
Mm.
argue that this was one of his most defining roles. As small as it is, I feel
Sure.
like Lester Bangs is one that is synonymous when someone utters the name Philip
He,
Seymour Hoffman.
he had two great performances in the year 2000, maybe even more if I'm forgetting anything, because he obviously had Lester Bangs here with Almost Famous, but then his performance in David Mamet's State of Maine is also
Mm-hmm.
really good, a very
Yep.
different kind of performance.
Yes.
But in just 1 year, we get to see even the early range of one Philip Seymour Hoffman.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. With all of that laid out, if you're not familiar, and I'm guessing most of you are, but just in case, if you're new to Almost Famous, it is about a high school boy in the early 1970s. He is given a chance to write a story for Rolling Stone magazine about an up and coming rock band as he accompanies them on their concert tour.
Mhm.
This is also semi biographical for Cameron Crowe.
Yeah.
He did do something of the sort. He convinced a major magazine to let him tour with a rock band, and he did write and have many of these experiences. Of course, the film is exaggerated a little bit, but
Sure.
semi autobiographical for Mr. Cameron Crowe. With all that said, Brendan, what do you think about Almost Famous?
Well, I'm glad you opened up with the fact that this film is semi-autobiographical, and that band that he did tour with was the Allman Brothers Band, if I'm not mistaken, and did somehow convince Rolling Stone to allow him to write for not just their tour, but for them as a band. And a lot of the things that we do see here in the movie are there is some truth to some of that. And I know that Glenn Fry from the Eagles was also part of this narrative as well in some way from Cameron Crowe's perspective. But it's interesting when we see these autobiographical tales of some type of artistic process that then leads to these people becoming filmmakers. I mean, in a way, Almost Famous sits pretty closely with something like The Fabelmans in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even more recently, something like Dee Dee. We didn't even
Yeah.
really talk much about how Dee Dee and The Fabelmans are really
Yeah, they're
cousins
connected.
in a way.
Yeah.
They really are connected, and Almost
Mm-hmm.
Famous, in a very different lane, does something pretty similar.
Which
I
and sorry to cut in real fast, but
Mhm.
a really fascinating factoid as it relates to what you're talking about is that Cameron Crowe did send this screenplay to Steven Spielberg, who reiterated he should direct every word of the screenplay. And Cameron Crowe pretty much did that. He shot about 95% of what was originally there on that screenplay that Spielberg read. And I find that fascinating. I don't know if it's simply coincidence or if maybe
yeah,
it
it might be.
inspired Spielberg 20 years later to essentially do the
wonder.
same thing for himself. I don't
wonder.
know. I don't know.
It
But
wasn't
Almost
just Spielberg's
Famous-
parents' divorce. It was also
Yeah.
Cameron Crowe that allowed him to make
Yeah.
The Fabelmans.
because this is essentially Cameron Crowe's Fablemans. In
Yeah.
a lot of ways, it is.
It is. Yeah, and I think what makes the film so special is, much like The Fabelmans, it's not really about one particular thing. It's not a really easy film to digest when you really think about it. That doesn't make the film complex in a philosophical way by comparison to something like, let's say, a Terrence Malick, for instance. It's not that type of complexity, but Almost Famous carries one of the key ingredients that I think makes a nearly perfect movie, is that it feels like a different movie every time you rewatch it. And I think it's because the film is juggling so many different perspectives with so many different
Mhm.
outlooks on not just coming of age, but the idea of observation, how that plays into the idea of artistic observation, whether you actually participate in that world or not, and does that world then have any obligation to even include you? What is it like to be an outsider looking in, and how does that then translate to the world of journalism? Many journalists see this film as kind of a benchmark for how to be a good journalist and how to be very objective in your interpretation of very well recognized figures, right? So in some ways, I actually think this movie does a better job at the unbiased, objective journalism thing than Civil War did from earlier this year. And that movie was very much about that thing. It's,
Sure.
but
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
it's juggling a lot of things. Almost Famous is, and that's what makes the film not just rewatchable, but every time I've seen it, I feel like I get a new perspective out of it and a new reading on it.
Yeah.
Even though the film itself, from a narrative standpoint, isn't really complicated. It's a very simple story, and that simplicity makes it even all the more intriguing and introspective and interpretive. That's what's so great about the film, and we'll certainly talk further about what some of those themes are, how some of these individual characters play a part into that idea of cool versus uncool, or I guess the real definition being real versus a facade. You know, how does that, where's that line drawn? A lot of interesting things this movie is doing. I think it's great.
Yeah, Cameron Crowe really hit lightning in a bottle with this one. Not that he isn't capable of writing other great screenplays or making other great movies, but there's something about the prodigious layers of this film and what it has to say about coming of age and music and finding your identity that I think makes it one of the best films of the 2000s. The writing is so rich and assiduous for all of the reasons you're stating there. It's often very funny. Every character is meticulously thought out. The dialogue is sharp and intuitive. It definitely will be a contender for Best Original Screenplay at our Best of the Decade Awards next week. And while the screenplay is, in many regards, the MVP here, Crowe's direction is also noteworthy. The concerts feel like real concert footage. The composition and framing and how he captures the performances in this film are a key factor in it resonating the way it does. The editing, I think, is fantastic as well, in both capturing the sincerity of the film's emotion, but also its humor. As simple as it is, one of my favorite moments here is the party scene where Russell is high on acid and William asks one of the band members, "How do I know when the drugs kick in?" Which is immediately followed by a cut to Russell on the roof of the house yelling, "I am a golden god," and the crowd erupting. It is fantastic.
Quote me. I'm on drugs. And I think that moment did really happen involving, was it Robert Plant, maybe, of Led Zeppelin, or maybe that was where one of the Eagles
came.
Yeah. So there is that. You know, that's the thing. Cameron Crowe is pulling potential factoids from different rock and roll avenues for this story, but I like the blender effect of it all.
It's really great, and the humor is quite blistering at times. I love it as a coming of age for William in his search for identity and love, as the film has a lot to say about the critic's relationship to the artist as compared to their art. I certainly want to dive into that and all of the film's thematic nuances. And this is a film that is maybe more dense than it might seem on the surface. And to your point, much of that very much comes through the more you rewatch this movie. And also, I want to, at least here in my opening thoughts, just simply state how awesome this cast is. The performances here are sublime, top to bottom, starting with Patrick Fugit. I certainly want to talk about him as well. Frances McDormand, and as we noted earlier, Philip Seymour Hoffman. Everyone here is sensational on their A game, and I think that also is a big part of why this film is so charming and earnest in its attempts, whether it be emotionally, thematically, as characters, whatever the case may be. It's really fantastic. I absolutely love the film.
Yeah. You mentioned the editing there. I have to agree with you. It's not just the comedic editing, but it's one of those films that just feels like there's no real wasted space. And apparently there is an extended version of this movie, which I admittedly have not seen. I don't know if you have.
I have not. I've heard that some of it does bring a little bit more texture to some of these scenes. Some of it is quite unnecessary as well. So I don't know. I haven't seen it, but I've heard mixed things about the extended cut, though.
Yeah, I mean, the original theatrical cut is so great on its face. I don't know how even an extended version really serves a purpose, just given how
Yeah.
nearly perfect that original version is. I know that there
Yeah.
were some things that were cut that maybe didn't fit, such as apparently there was a planned sequence that utilized the entirety of Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven. And for context, for those who don't know the song, it's an 8-minute song and it's 8 minutes on the dot. So there would have been an 8-minute sequence utilizing that, which obviously didn't get used in the final film. But I know like, Jimmy Page and Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin did see this movie and gave Cameron Crowe such a blessing to use their music because of how much they love the film. And that's why you get so much Led Zeppelin here. And you get a lot of deep cuts from Led Zeppelin. You get a lot from their third album, which is more of their folk exploratory album, which I actually think is one of their best. So I love that the film treats its music as also a time capsule for its setting. Like it all feels so complimentary here. So whether that be in the editing or just the soundtrack and how it's interwoven within the editing, it's a very well crafted film. So you're right that Cameron Crowe does need to get even more credit here as a director, just as much as he does a writer. He really was kind of on fire at this point. You look at his filmography leading up to Almost Famous. He was kind of on a almost like a Rob Reiner like run where everything he directed was nearly some type of masterpiece of its kind. It's so it's so interesting. We could talk maybe a little bit about Cameron Crowe, the filmmaker, post Almost Famous. I think he's still pretty interesting to say the least. Needless to say, I think this might be his best film, primarily because of how interwoven that it is, which I'm sure we'll certainly talk about the film's many thematic layers, but it's really intelligently interwoven, and it doesn't commit to one thematic idea without it feeling like it's not committing to any thematic idea, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I completely agree, and I do want to jump into that, but quickly just to speak to Crowe as a director once again. I noted the performances here that he gets out of this cast is great. The editing is fantastic. And even the use of the camera, I think, is underrated here because while much of it might seem standard, there are moments here where it is very much not, or at least you noticed there is precise uses of close-ups or lingering shots on performers as they simply interact with the camera in this fascinating way that enhances much of the character or the emotion, the drama, the conflict, whatever the case may be. And I do really love that here. And most prominently, and I can't really speak to this myself because I am not a music expert by any means, but those that are, when they talk about this movie and the editing and the interjection of the music and how it complements everything we see here, everyone that can speak to that only has great things to say about the use of the music, the implementation of the rock music.
Well, part of that too is the musical score here, which isn't rock music per se, but there is a relationship to the history of rock and roll music there because the music was scored by Nancy Wilson. And GD, you're familiar with the band Heart, right?
Yes.
Songs like Barracuda, Magic Man.
Yeah.
She's the guitarist for Heart. So there is a cross-pollination happening there, with the history of music and how it played. Yeah, so Cameron Crowe, not only has he's done his research, but it's a passion that really makes the experience all the more authentic, I think.
And she was Cameron Crowe's wife at the time as well.
That's true. Yeah.
Plays into it.
yeah. So marital status certainly plays into it, but it was used smartly.
I need a composer. You're free. I need you to do it.
It was used intelligently. Right call, Cameron. Right call.
But yes, to speak to what you were saying earlier and the thematic nuance of this film, I do want to dive into that. And I guess we can start with what is going to be most prominent with this film in terms of that idea of the relationship the critic has with the artist as compared to the art. That is such a fascinating component to this film that that you and I engage in every single week here on the show
Yeah.
because we are fans of film. That's why
Yeah.
we got into this. We have posters on our wall, just like William does with the various bands in the walls of his bedroom. However, the moment you become a critic, your fandom does become exposed when you have to be honest about the art that you're reviewing. And that can be tricky at times, especially when you find yourself around the artist. But that's what makes Lester Bangs one of the best characters in the film, because he's always looking out for William and encouraging him not to fall into the trap of becoming friends with the rock stars. Be honest and unmerciful is something he says a couple of times throughout the film to William. Don't let them rewrite you, he says in another exchange. Those moments with Lester are vital because William is a fan of the music. And the scene where he first meets Stillwater, we see immediately he knows their names. He knows their songs. He can even articulate eloquently why the music is great. And Lester knows that by becoming friends with the artist, you risk losing truth in your writing. It's such a fascinating dichotomy in the film. You don't want to appear uncool in front of the artist you love, but as Lester puts it, great art isn't born from cool. The industry becoming cool has made it a dangerous time for rock and roll. At least that's certainly the ethos from Lester. William maintaining his uncool factor is important for him as a writer, and Lester reminding him of that in the film is really incredible. The consideration of art and the power that it has in this film, I think, is really fantastic. And it certainly comes through in a myriad of ways. But that relationship, that specific relationship of the artist and the critic, and the importance of maintaining or like riding that line to make sure that you never lose out on that honesty. I love how that comes about here.
Yeah, and what I love about it too is that this takes place in 1973, if I'm not mistaken, and when William introduces himself to Stillwater for the first time, and he knows their names, he knows their music, the reaction from the band Stillwater is like, wait a minute, we've never experienced a journalist who knows this much about us. As if to suggest that maybe this is a new kind of journalism that's meant to straddle that line between subjective and objectivity, which is a very difficult thing to do. And the journey of this movie is to showcase how difficult that is for William, because Lester constantly tells him these people are not your friends. And Lester is not wrong in saying that.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the film has a lot of intrigue around the idea of artistic journalism specifically. And it can translate to any medium. We know this very adamantly, right, JD?
Yeah.
We're in the film critic business, but that doesn't mean we're also in the film business. There's a huge difference. And just because we love the thing that we're covering doesn't mean that that thing then has this obligation to invite us in, because they won't. You know, it's a very different thing. And maintaining that right kind of distance allows the right kind of work to come out of it, but also it doesn't cross the line into an overly biased viewpoint of these people. And I love that William has to learn this lesson of what it means, cool versus uncool. I mentioned that earlier. Uncool basically means being authentic. The authenticity is the uncool side of it. Cool is the facade. It's the world that he's portraying. So that's where that line has to be straddled. And I think it's such a fascinating lesson to learn for many journalism, for many journalists out there, I think.
I completely agree. And while you and I don't necessarily interact with the artists all that much, I did think a lot about on this revisit and considering the film's ideas on cool and uncool. My interview with Jeff Nichols,
I was
thought
thinking
about
the
that
exact same thing. I was thinking that same thing too, man.
Because like William, you don't want to appear uncool in front of them. William presents himself as someone who is very knowledgeable and intellectual when it comes to their music. Similarly, I presented myself to Jeff as someone who knows his films very well, intimately,
Yeah.
even. And you want them to appreciate that on some level. And maybe you do find yourself drawn to them personally. And I'll be perfectly honest, if Jeff Nichols extended a hand and wanted to become a friend of mine, I would have a really hard time saying no to that.
I know,
A
but
really
then,
hard time.
but
But
here's the thing.
how
You're
would that influence how I review his movies
I
going
know,
forward, though?
but here's the thing. You're smart enough to have that conversation with yourself, right?
Yeah.
Like, there are some people who maybe want to join this type of business that we're in, and they might want to do it for the wrong reasons because it gets them
Yeah.
close
He gets them
to the
in.
to the
Yeah.
thing that they love, and that's that's maybe the big difference between what William Miller has to learn versus someone like Penny Lane, played by Kate Hudson.
I was going to say, that's the difference between a critic and a Band-Aid.
Yeah, big difference, and that's that's the duality between the two of them, and why in some ways, like, the biggest arc of any character in the movie might be Penny Lane in some way. At least the most growth that a character has to experience might be her. If anything, William Miller's arc here is more like he more or less begins and ends the film in the same place, but there's more of a introspective recognition of what it means to be a good critic and to be a good journalist, and how to balance that line. So he has a lesson to be learned, but the growth is Penny Lane's character. That's where I think it's and it's the important one too.
Well, I think that leads into another aspect of this film that I want to talk about. As much as this movie is about the critic relationship to artists and their art, I think this film, in many regards, is also about performance, whether it be on the stage, in the bus, around William, around women. These characters are putting on some sort of performance. And I think that's the great irony of this film, acting as a coming of age for William, and how he is thrust into a different reality than any other kid his age who would be going to high school and graduating, which is what I love about the insert shots of him missing his high school graduation about 2/3 of the way through the film.
Yeah.
Because you could argue that William isn't really experiencing a normal reality here. The life of a rock star is abnormal. You're on the road a ton. You're partying like there's no tomorrow. You have access to everything. So everything becomes a performance. The band and their concerts are the most obvious. However, there's a certain level of them pretending that everything is fine where there is clear conflict between them. It's also in how they act around William at times, because after all, he is a journalist working on behalf of Rolling Stone magazine. So they are wary of him at times. They call him the enemy.
Yeah.
And as a result, they aren't always authentic, or at least there's a discussion about whether they should or should not be. And to your point about Penny Lane, she's also a significant part of this. Penny Lane is a name that she gives herself. It's not even her birth name. Her relationship with Russell is a performance. The first time they meet, when William quote unquote introduces them, it is obvious that they already know each other, but they're putting on a show for William. There's a lot here about performance and avoiding the truth that sneakily gives this film this facade when it comes to William's coming of age that I think adds so many more layers to the conflict of this film and all of the other thematic components that we can talk about. I find that really arresting here.
Yeah, I mean, you want to create a more superficial definition of this movie, thematically speaking, at least. It's basically be true to yourself, just be yourself. It's as simple as that. But there's something really interesting about the way the film funnels that idea through the avenue of a rock and roll band, which is all about putting on a facade. Rock and roll bands, especially in the 1970s, they were notorious for living a very particular lifestyle that didn't necessarily translate on the stage. Sometimes it did, and in some of those cases,
Yeah.
those band members may have died very young. I'll just simply say. But
Yeah.
there is that line between reality and facade that very much exists in rock and roll. So funneling that idea through that specific avenue, I do think is very fascinating. And there is a lot of truth to it. I mean, I played a band. When I'm on stage, I put on a show. It's a very different vibe. If I had a bad day that day, I'm not showcasing that on stage. I have to check that at the door. And this movie is very adamant about that thing. So the idea that these individuals who have to learn that lesson are spending time with those who straddle that line between facade and reality, I think is a really fascinating choice of character to do that.
Yeah, I completely agree, because on one hand, it's presented early on anyway that William is going to get to experience some sort of reality outside of the structure and the confines of adolescence and being in high school. But I do think that there's a falseness to that. Or again, there's a great irony to it that the reality he experiences in this film is manufactured because of the performances of everyone around him. Are they being authentic? And there clearly is some sort of facade with everybody. But what's brilliant about the filming, Crowe's writing, is that he starts to peel away at that facade. And ultimately, we do find these characters in moments of vulnerability where that truth then becomes exposed. I think of Penny Lane in the moment where, and again, Penny Lane isn't a name that, it's not her birth name. It's something she gives to herself. She's always presenting herself to William in a very specific way, although she is in love with Russell. So it's difficult at times for William to figure out what is her motive. What is Penny Lane, or what does she mean to me? But in one of her most vulnerable moments here, when those facades are stripped away, she gets a little cathartic and she says about Russell, why can't he love me? Or why doesn't he love me? And it's a heartbreaking moment in this film, because we see her at her, not just her most vulnerable, but it's as if the makeup that she had been wearing dissolved and she didn't know how to respond other than to let that honesty kind of come out. I don't even know if it was intentional. The catharsis, like her humanity, just kind of spilled over in this really great moment. And then to see William react to that is also fascinating, given the dynamic between those two characters. But like, that's the brilliance though of the writing and the performances here and the marriage between them.
It's almost as if Penny Lane was experiencing that type of rejection for the first time, recognizing that, okay, I'm merely an object for these people's facades, right? That's really what it is. And she may have experiencing that for the first time, didn't know how to react. Because the thing as a quote unquote Band-Aid, which is their more polite definition of groupie, if we're being honest. The world of rock and roll has always been, when I say kind to groupies, I mean people in bands are usually kind to groupies because it fuels their image, it fuels their facade, right? So groupies on the other end of that psychologically see that as a form of togetherness, as a form of welcoming, like they're the ones being welcomed. But really, bands are really just latching onto the idea of pretty girls giving them attention. That's really all it is. And Penny Lane is finally recognizing that it's not about her. It's just simply because I'm a female object to fuel this band's desires at the moment. And that's when the curtain begins to, open up a bit, and she has to learn that.
Absolutely. And you do wonder, again, because of the performance of it all, even though she rejects the idea in those opening scenes, we are not groupies. She defends herself as someone that is above being a groupie.
They're better than groupies.
Exactly.
Yeah, we're first class groupies is basically
exactly. But similarly, they don't have a straightforward relationship with these guys. They're having to perform around them. Similarly, the band is performing around them because many of them, if not all of them, have wives and girlfriends, as Russell states. So there's this constant maneuvering of the chess pieces as it relates to that facade. And when that's stripped away, then how do you respond? On the flip side of that coin tonally, that moment with Penny is obviously heartbreaking for that character. But on the humor side of it, and forgive me, I can't remember which band member it is, but there comes a moment where, as William begins to interview the Stillwater band, he asks one of the members, do you have to be depressed to write a sad song? Do you have to be in love to write a love song? And the band member doesn't know how to respond to that level of authenticity. Like the facade has been stripped. William is being authentic and earnest in this very clever and smart presentation of this question. And the only thing he can say is, when did you get so professional? Like,
that was
which is
a
really funny quip.
Yeah,
and it's like he doesn't know how to respond. Like I can't respond with a fake answer, because most of the time these questions are fake, or there's a facade, or they're not well thought out, so I can give you these lazy answers. This is a real question about music. I don't know how to answer you. And it's really funny. Like, it's really funny in the moment.
I think what's funny too is because the band, I think in the moment, recognized, okay, we're bringing along this journalist who's representing Rolling Stone, but not only is he young, but he's a fan. And then all of a sudden, this question is asked, and it was Russell, Billy Crudup's character, who was on the receiving end of that question. It's almost as if that look was, crap, this guy actually does mean business, doesn't he? So like I think that's what's so great about Billy Crudup's performance as well, is there are layers there. It's not just the arc that Russell goes through, which we can certainly talk about further, but there are hidden nuances to the way he reacts to things that almost have multiple meanings in a way. And I think in that moment, you could see it as a great comedic bit, like you're talking about, but it almost seems to suggest Russell and the rest of his band potentially thinking, maybe it was a mistake bringing this guy on board. Like that was a real question, wasn't it?
Exactly. And it starts to poke holes in their facade in this fascinating way. And again, that's the wonderful contrast of the film and Crowe's writing and directing here. At times, it taps into the emotional side of the characters. At times, it's often very funny. He rides that line wonderfully. And I think another big reason all of that works is Patrick Fugit and his performance. He was honestly perfect for this role. There is an innocence to that character that he evokes impeccably. His eyes, especially, and how he captures that innocence through his eyes, is spellbinding. Yeah. And I think that's important because William is someone who's discovering in a very real way what the world can be like. Although, as we've been talking about, there's certainly a falseness or a facade to all of that. But he is experiencing something beyond the conventions of high school. And I love how his innocence interweaves with that throughout the film. So he finds himself in these precarious situations. There's a vivid contrast between his unfiltered purity and the reality that exists around him. And I love seeing how the film, again, brings conflict and emotion out of that, such as the moment when he tries to convey anger and mystery to Penny.
He's
fed up with Russell.
He's not very good at it.
Well, that's the hilarity of it, right? Like he's tired of Russell not giving him the interview. Penny keeps leading him on about Morocco, but in that moment when he's trying to evoke some sort of anger and mystery, Penny clearly sees right through that facade. He might be yelling and trying to be mad, but all you see is the innocence in William, and how Fugit manifests that in his performance. It's really sublime. It's great. And I also think of the reaction shots of the character. And I think that is the greatness of his performance. He obviously has a lot to say here, but more often than not, Crowe shows us William reacting to what's around him, and Fugit denotes that innocence and purity again with this stimulating perfection. And that's why in my opening thoughts I wanted to emphasize the camera, because we get so many close-ups, in one instance an extreme close-up on those eyes, and it's such a big part of the character. Like, he's just sitting around, oftentimes being shy and not saying anything, and yet it feels as if he is screaming to the camera simultaneously. And it's just, again, it might be lightning in a bottle, I don't know, but he was perfect for that role and that character.
We don't talk about the cinematography enough for this movie. Cinematographer John Toll here, who, if you're in the film critic sphere, or just in any cinephile sphere, whatever you want to call it, that name might sound familiar, because this man has worked with Terrence Malick before. John Toll shot The Thin Red Line, also worked on movies like Braveheart, The Last Samurai, pretty recently The Matrix Resurrections, Harriet. This is a guy that knows how to shoot an epic movie. And here he is shooting a 1970s coming-of-age music film. And it's a beautiful looking movie, which we don't often talk about. And a lot of it is because of the way the camera flows, the overall color palette, the close-up shots, the choice of what is focused on in those moments like you're talking about. I do think it's great. And maybe this is also another praise to give to the editing. But some of those filmmaking, I don't want to call them tricks, but some of those tactics really emphasize how good Patrick Fugit is here as William Miller, because this was his first film, his first major film, rather.
Yeah.
And this goes back to something we've said a few times in the past, JD, where a performance can sometimes seem a little bit off, like it doesn't really work, and that inexperience actually makes it work for the film that they're in. And I get that sense from Patrick Fugit. I do get the sense that maybe he was a pretty inexperienced and maybe nervous actor on set. And whatever Crowe and his team did to tap into that is what makes the performance so good, unless it was deliberate. You know, maybe I'm just not giving Patrick Fugit enough credit. Maybe it was a very deliberate sense of inexperience and nervousness that adds to the character.
But that is the character. That is
one
the
way or
character.
another. It works. Whatever the execution was, it works.
Like, William has zero experience as a journalist. He somehow contrived his way into this scenario. He has no real life experience.
Yeah.
He's, as the film states, he's never really been around girls. He's never had sex, has never been around drugs. Part of that is because of his mom and growing up in that house. And I do absolutely want to talk about that character here in a moment as well. But
how have we gone this far and not talked about Frances
I know.
McDormand?
We'll get to her here in a moment. And that's certainly a big part of it. But he is completely innocent, this character. And I think there's something about Fugit being so green as an actor that just works so lavishly in that regard, because William does act as if he has no experience. He's making up the journalism thing as he goes. He loves music. He loves this band. And there's a level of him being able to either come up with a question that is clever because he's a fan, or if he isn't, he's using Lester as a way to come across as I know what I'm doing, right? Because at least 3 different times here, he, in exchanges with either Rolling Stone or with Stillwater, he uses Lester Bang's quotes as his own. And people respond to it as,
piece.
That's really, exactly. You know, it's like he's completely making it up as he goes. And maybe Fugit was doing the same thing, making it up as he went along because he was so green and new. I don't really know, but that's what makes the marriage of it so wonderful. And again, it might have been lightning in a bottle, a happy accident. But he was perfect. Like, it comes off impeccably.
And yet we have to believe that William Miller is also a very good writer.
Yes.
If there's one thing I will say, and this is not really a criticism because I kind of like the what if of it and the fact that it was so easy to become a Rolling Stone writer in the early 70s,
Yeah,
like
clearly.
without any background checks or anything like that. In a way, I think that's sort of interwoven as a joke or like sort of a cryptic joke in a way in
Sure.
this movie. But at the same time, I do wonder if the film would have benefited from at least getting a little bit more visibility in his writing and maybe hearing a bit more and seeing a bit more of what his capabilities were. Because we just have to take it at face value that because he is experiencing this as both a fan and an objective observer, that's what makes him a great writer. So it still does work symbolically. I think that is still working for the film, but I do wonder, would the film have benefited from maybe getting a bit more detail there? I'm not sure.
I don't know.
The fact that I am thinking about that is perhaps a compliment to the film because it's
Yeah.
asking me to take part in the conversation. It's bringing
Yeah.
me into it to think, okay, what is his writing style actually like? Like how good
Yeah.
of a writer is he, and what made him so good that Rolling Stone wanted him like that? Like it's a pretty incredible thing.
It is pretty incredible. I'm honestly glad the film doesn't get too bogged down in that because there's so much
Okay.
else here that is fascinating, such as his relationship as a critic to the artist, as we talked about. I would much rather the film delve into those layers and nuances because,
Sure.
again, the
Doesn't get distracted
dichotomies
then, which
there,
is
yeah,
good.
exactly. Like that's a fascinating idea to explore, as we talked about earlier, and it's something we have to grapple with ourselves.
Yeah.
Or the facades and the performances, as we were talking about, and the conflict, the dramas between the band. Does this T-shirt suck or doesn't it? Like, I'm way more interested in that than is William a good writer. Like, I'm willing to just simply buy
This
that he can do
yeah.
this.
This movie gets into the greatest thing about band t-shirts. Never put your band on a band t-shirt. The best band shirts do not feature the band. That's how you get away with it.
Yeah, I love it. No, it's such a fun moment in the film.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's so much going on, and then there's of course the Penny Lane of it all. Like and again, Elaine, I want to talk about here in a moment, or Lester Bangs when he becomes involved. There's so much to William and his journey here as it relates to the tour and him writing the pieces that I think Cameron Crowe does a good job of just letting that unfold organically enough that we just buy it. If you don't, I
Well,
mean, the film will not work for you
Well,
at
yeah, the
all.
fact that you do buy it is a testament to the film being able to get away with it without that
Yeah,
needed exposition
yeah,
necessarily. So
exactly.
it is
Like
it
I've
is a
never
credit.
really thought
Yeah,
about it, to be honest. Like I just buy it. Like I just
yeah.
okay, he's good enough to
Well,
write, and maybe some of it is the time. It's the '70s. Things were
yeah,
different
and
then. I
and
don't
and
know,
like
but
I said, I think it does work symbolically because of the situation that William Miller is in allows him to straddle that line between objective journalism and fandom in a way that I
yeah,
think is in many ways the ethos of this movie as far as what it's saying about journalistic integrity. So I think it is working
yeah.
symbolically in that regard, regardless.
Yeah, and I think it also works because of that first conversation he has with Lester, where he
Hmm.
tells him that he's been writing for his school magazine for some time. So we know
Hmm.
that at least at the high school level, he's been doing this. He has some
Yeah.
experience and it's something he wants to do. He's approaching Lester because he wants to learn what it's like to be a critic in the real world and what do I have to do to make it, and it's such a
Hmm.
fun conversation between him and Lester there. You don't get paid too much.
Philip Seymour
It's a
Hoffman, man.
like it's an industry of cool. It's a dangerous time for rock and roll. Be honest and
Yeah.
unmerciful. All of that is really great. I also just love the moment where he says, "Do you take drugs?" Like it's just a funny little thing there. And also,
His performance here reminds me of like if hypothetically Almost Famous actually took place in the year it came out. This is what Dusty from Twister would be doing if he decided to give up
maybe,
tornado
yeah,
chasing.
a little bit
This
of a
is his
similar
life.
vibe. Yeah. And I also love how he's like, well, I can't just sit here and spend time with my fans all day long. Immediate cut to them in a restaurant talking further about
I know,
music and being a critic.
Yeah,
Like,
it's
again,
adorable.
great editing there for the humor. But that whole intersection, to bring it back to the point, it does give credence to the idea that he's been doing this for some amount of time. Maybe just at the high school level, of course, amateurly, but he's a
Sure.
writer for his school newspaper. And there's something about that and how the film just kind of presents William within these scenarios that you just buy it. Like, I
Yeah.
think he does enough there at the beginning to make all of that work.
Yeah, I believed it. And the fact that he was able to come up with a question on the fly like that even stumped Russell Hammond, like we talked about
Yeah,
earlier.
exactly.
When did you become so professional? Yeah, so there are little nuances placed throughout the film that cue you in of William Miller's credibility, which is
Yes.
ultimately all you need.
Exactly. Can we talk about Elaine? Shall we move to Frances McDormand?
She's a goddess. She's a
She's really great
goddess.
here. It is quietly heartbreaking in this film, Elaine.
Mhm.
There is a scene that takes place halfway through where she's talking to William on the phone and she tenderly just says, I don't know what I did to drive my kids away. Was I not fun? Which is poignant on its own, but even more so when Cameron cuts from her saying that
Yeah.
to William, who is
Yeah.
clearly distracted and not paying too much attention to her. And then the moment comes, or that moment, that exchange ends with
Yeah.
her telling William, I miss you and I love you. And again, he is distracted. So it's not something that registers despite it being this deep motherly plea to him. And it is
Mhm.
kind of devastating. It is a really touching moment in this movie. And it's amazing how that character probably shifts over time as you get older, because I
Yeah, it's
probably
true.
like, as much as I empathize with her fears and loneliness on this rewatch, watching this as a teenager in the early 2000s, I likely saw her in the same ways that Anita does at the beginning of the film as this overbearing mom. So it is kind of funny how that character can kind of evolve. And I think while the writing and all of that is fantastic, similarly to what we were talking about with Patrick Fugit, it
Mhm.
is the reaction shots. It is simply the camera still emphasizing Elaine and how she is reacting, whether it be within those fears and loneliness. Sometimes it's kind of funny the way she reacts to
Mhm.
what she hears on the phone and what William may be caught up in. I also think of that classroom scene, which I think is hysterical.
Rock
where
stars
she
have
just
kidnapped my son. People
cut
just think it's
to-
part of the lecture.
Exactly, that's the brilliance of it. Crow cuts to a girl in the class writing that down as if
Oh,
it
okay.
needs to be something
Okay.
that.
Yeah, I got to remember that for the test.
Exactly. Like, it's so good.
Yeah.
But yeah, Frances McDormand, and she's in this film, I think, more than you might remember. At least I don't
Oh, this is
recall her
yeah.
being in this film as much, but on this rewatch, it's like, man, she's in this a lot. And I don't know if it's, again, becoming a parent and my life changing. I'm no longer the teenagers that we see in this film and all of the cool and uncool that they're having to deal with. Man, Elaine, I saw myself in that character a lot here, and McDormand just freaking nails it.
I'm sorry, but if Michelle Williams can get nominated for Best Leading Actress in The Fabelmans, why is Frances McDormand nominated for Best Supporting Actress for Almost Famous? Because you're right, she's in the movie quite a bit and serves a very specific and important purpose. We often talk a lot with this movie. We've done it on this podcast quite a bit already. This line between facade and authenticity, and how William Miller is literally straddling that line between his experiences working with a rock band. You don't get more of a facade than that. and his experiences and interactions with his mother. And Frances McDormand's Elaine, she has this sort of ironic facade of a sort because she's overbearing in a very comedic way, but she is arguably the only truly authentic character from beginning to end. And that whole
there's no facades with her.
There's no facade whatsoever, even if you don't necessarily agree with her methods and her beliefs. There's nothing fake about her. So the writing of the character on one hand serves a symbolic purpose in allowing William Miller to straddle that line quite literally. But man, does Frances McDormand just sell it. Absolutely sells it. It makes me wonder, would she have potentially won this Oscar had it not been for Fargo? And again, I have not seen the film Pollock, where Marcia Gay Harden won Best Supporting Actress that specific year. So I guess a little bit of inside baseball. That's one aspect of my homework I haven't done for our 2000 retrospective there. But I do wonder, like, a performance like this just feels front runner like. I think it's that good, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, I did see Pollock. It, spoiler alert, will not crack my top 10 or my top 20 for our retrospective. Okay. I think Marcia Gay Harden is good in the film. She is good.
I don't doubt that. She's a great actress.
Yeah, she's fantastic. Is it better than Kate Hudson or Frances McDormand? I would say no. I would have voted for either one of those. And I do think Kate Hudson is equally great here for many of the reasons we talked about earlier. But Frances McDormand is maybe underratedly one of the best in this film, if not the best performance. Now, I don't know if I would call it a lead performance. I don't know if I would say the same thing about the Fabelmans as well. Those are supporting performances.
Yeah.
But I think that what McDormand is doing here is a great juxtaposition to everything else we see in the film. I think you make a really great point there. And it does render some heart-wrenching moments in this film. And it also makes for one of the more uplifting moments of the film. And maybe this is some slight spoilers here, but there's that moment at the end when William and Anita both come home and somewhat surprise her there. And it's touching, like it's uplifting. It's kind of funny, like that moment with Anita where she's like, I forgive you. I didn't apologize. And they just kind of laugh about it. Is
so
really
sweet.
Great.
It's so sweet.
Yeah, it's so great. Like her performance is quietly a big part of the nucleus here. And I think it's great. And again, that's why maybe this is just Crowe capturing lightning in a bottle, because he gets this great performance from McDormand. He gets a performance from Kate Hudson that there's nothing close to it in her career, I don't think. Like, this is her best work as well.
Probably. Yeah, I would say so. I mean, it's certainly very different than what she would do afterwards. I mean, I'm admittedly, I'm not comparing this performance to Almost Famous because it's not nearly as good as Almost Famous, but I'm admittedly a sucker for the kind of roles that she did in films like How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days. I think she's really charming in those films opposite Matthew McConaughey, but this is this is a star-making performance, and it's a reason why she became a star after this.
And look, I'm not saying she isn't without charm or that she isn't good in all of these other films. Don't get me wrong.
This
really
one
like
just
her as an
asks
actress.
very different things from her.
It asks very different
challenging
things.
things from her.
She's such a big part of the movie, and she taps into those facades impeccably, as we talked about earlier, which leads to some heartbreaking moments for that character as well, or at least the honest truth that comes about is vivid because of her performance. But you're right. She's really good in something like How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days. She was fantastic in Glass Onion just a few years ago.
I was just thinking of that too. Yeah, she was quite, I mean, like her one exchange with Daniel Craig became one of the biggest memes or gifts of the past, like, 4 years or something like that.
Yeah, 100%. So, like, she's always charming and a fun presence on screen, but I don't think anything comes quite to the nuances of Almost Famous. Billy Crudup had a great year as well, and he's fantastic in this film. And Patrick Fugit, as we talked about, might be a coincidence, might be a happy accident, given what we're talking about here as far as Cameron Crowe capturing lightning in a bottle. Maybe it was intentional. I'm going to hire this green actor because this character needs to exude this innocence, this I don't know what I'm doing. And of course, Fugit taps into that perfectly for all the reasons we mentioned earlier. So like, it just feels like everything is functioning the way it should, from the performances to the writing to the direction, the editing. Everything is quite flawless here. I have one quibble that I could bring up. I don't know how you feel about this.
I'm curious if it's the same quibble I have. Again, it's not really a quibble. I think, well, actually, you know what? I think quibble, that word specifically, is probably most appropriate, because I don't think it's really a problem with the film. I think it's something that has become more distracting as the years have gone on, assuming we're talking about the same thing. So I don't
Okay.
want to jump the
Yeah, I
gun.
don't
Okay,
know.
but like, what are you thinking of that you have a slight criticism of?
Okay, so I'm thinking about the moment with Rolling Stone, the fact checker scene, I think is
Oh, okay. I'm not
quite
thinking about that.
contrived. Like that moment I do think is undercooked, because and this is a pivotal moment in the film, right? The whole movie has been building to this. William is hired by Rolling Stone magazine to write this article. And it's really great. There's a lot of fun to be had. It's the art versus the artist, performances, facades, everything we've been talking about. Is he going to write the truth, or has he become friends with these characters and therefore the truth might be bent? Which of course is preceded by that great moment with Lester Bangs when they have that last phone call. I guess that technically happens after this moment.
Right.
But it's all woven impeccably. What's a little frustrating to me about the fact checker scene, though, is that Rolling Stone is all in on this. They have some questions about, okay, where's the article? What do you have? Send us what you have. They bring him to San Francisco so they can hash all of that out. But they're going to put this on the cover. That's how much they love the idea of William and what he's doing. However, when she goes to fact check and the band, like one member of the band is like, no, that's all nonsense, they completely scrap it all together. And it's a little jarring to go from, we're putting you on the cover in one moment, and literally the next, we're scrapping this all together. It's a little movie-ish in a way that is, and I would be more than willing to forgive something like that if it was a small moment in this film, something fleeting, something that didn't really tether to the film's dramatic conflict or the themes. But the whole film had been building to this. It was all about him, at least dramatically, narratively.
It's very deflating. It's very deflating.
It was all about him writing this magazine article. That's why he's there. So it's a little weird. It's a little weird how that
it's
plays
weird.
out.
It's weird. I didn't think about it as a problem in the moment. You're not wrong that it is a very big contrivance. I do wonder if it's yet another one of those cryptic moments, perhaps unintentionally, that depicts how easy it was and how weird it was to operate a business like this in the early 70s. And maybe it's, like an early 70s thing as far as music journalism is concerned. I kind of chalked it up to a similar thing as how easy it was for William Miller to be hired as a writer for Rolling Stone without them doing even a background check.
Well, and that's the thing. I feel like much of my issue with that scene would have been fixed. And I don't think the film has to really spend a lot of time on this, but simply address the fact that you hired a teenager without doing any sort of background check. We messed up here. We hired an amateur. We didn't really look into it. This is as much our fault as it is yours.
And apparently they didn't do that back then. From what I understand, that was something that was added to the process later on. So, if that moment you're talking about is meant to mirror how the process was very flawed back in the early 70s, I guess I could forgive it, but you're like, there is maybe that's a scene that maybe needed a bit more acknowledgement of that very thing in order to forgive the
Yeah.
contrivance, or at least turn the contrivance into a bit of a plot point in a way.
Yeah.
So perhaps the depiction of it maybe feels a little incomplete, I guess is the way to put it.
Yeah. And to bring clarity, because I was a little unsure a moment ago, but the last call he has with Lester Bangs is right before that moment, because he's trying to type out the story. He gets stuck. He calls Lester, and they have a really great conversation. Lester begins by simply saying something like, friendship, speaking of his friendship with Stillwater, is the booze they feed you. He's like, I met you, you're not cool. Don't be cool. Don't fall into that trap. And then they have this great conversation about art, what makes great art. The line that really sticks out to me, though, is when Lester says, the only real currency in this bankrupt world is what you share with someone else when you're uncool. That is a fascinating line in this film.
Should that be the new motto of our podcast?
It might be. I think so. That is going to be the next T-shirt at the very least. Don't
I'm not
let me
kidding. Write
forget
that down. And it's got to be in like the font of Almost Famous. It has to have that almost like autograph like font to it. Yeah. There you go. There you go.
We'll have to.
One of
make
us
that
in
our next
sunglasses. So
shirt.
there we
and
go.
it's definitely going to be the motto of the show. You're right. This is a turning point in session film history.
All right.
There's no doubt about it.
So basically, we just revealed this is the greatest movie ever made.
Yeah, might be the case. But I love that line because it strips away the stakes of I'm writing for Rolling Stone magazine, or I'm friendship, or I have friends with Stillwater, or whatever. Like, it just takes everything down to zero. That the only thing that matters is the raw honesty you share with someone else that isn't living some sort of facade, that is being real. And that inspires him to then be honest with his article. And that's when he puts everything into it. He doesn't he risks everything as it relates to Russell and the members of Stillwater. And so then he presents that to Rolling Stone. They fact check it. Russell denies it. And then the film goes from there. So like, it's just like, there's such a fascinating series of events that leads to that moment for them to just go, nope, we're done here. It's a little weird.
They had a very flawed verification process back then. And you're not wrong that I guess if that scene were to make more sense, we needed more of an acknowledgement of that, because it does feel like an underwritten sort of explanation in a way.
And it's ultimately a quibble because the film does remedy that still in the end with that great moment between him, speaking of William, and Russell. I love that moment as well, where Russell shows up at William's house and they have that great conversation. And Russell, speaking to William, says, well, it seems as if we both liked her, speaking of Penny, but he's like, I guess she wanted us to be together, is what he says there.
It's
and
kind of
it's
adorable.
a great little irony there. And so they have the interview, and then the film fixes itself. Russell ends up calling Rolling Stone, and the article ends up getting published, and the honesty and the truth of it still comes out. So like, it still works in the end. It's just a little jarring in execution. That one specific moment.
You're right. I don't blame you on that one. It's not the moment that I was considering as a quote unquote criticism for me. And like I was saying, it's not really a criticism of the film. I just think it's something that has become distracting as the years have gone on. I don't love Jimmy Fallon in this. But I think that's because of who Jimmy Fallon would become as the years went on. He is such.
I think that's why I can forgive it. They had no idea
that he would be the talk show host that he is now.
Exactly.
But that's the thing. I can't separate. I can no longer separate that Jimmy Fallon from the early days of
Yeah.
Jimmy Fallon, even before he was on Saturday Night
Yeah.
Live.
I mean, and that is understandable. It's something. It's
Yeah.
like when you watch Black Hawk Down and Tom Hardy is in the movie for like 3 minutes, and you're like, "Why is Tom Hardy in this movie for 3 minutes?"
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
it's just a little weird how
it's
that
kind of
plays
like
out.
that. But even so, like some of the mannerisms of Jimmy Fallon that I come to associate with him now are just now inadvertently being channeled into this performance that may not have even been channeled here in the first place. So it's like me projecting the things I sometimes don't like about Fallon into this performance. And
Yeah.
again, it's probably more of a me thing, but it was really distracting watching him again in this movie.
Gotcha.
But he's not in it that much. Thankfully, he's
No,
not in
he's
it that
not.
much.
I don't have too much of a problem with it again because
Okay.
of that historical context. And
Sure.
supposedly in the extended cut, he has much more of an impact in that scene where he explains why he's there, what he's doing, how they're going to get out of the financial
Interesting.
issues.
All right, maybe I don't
Yeah.
need to watch that one then.
Again, I haven't seen it. I don't know if that would enhance the sequence, if that would make it all the more distracting to your point. I don't really know. But yeah, he's in this movie very briefly.
Yeah,
Like
it's two
a-
scenes. It's
a
the scene in the
couple of-
plane,
yeah.
the opening scene there. Yeah,
That's about
yeah.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So okay. Well, anything else? Any final thoughts on
one
Almost
one
Famous?
yeah, one final thing. The character of Russell Hammond. Did you know that it was originally going to be played by Brad Pitt?
No, I don't know if. Well, I mean, I'm sure Pitt could have made it work, but I don't know. There's something
about Billy Crudup here. There's something about not having
Yeah.
the most recognizable star face of that time in that role.
Yeah, I think that's it. I
Yeah.
just wonder if his stardom would have maybe undermined.
I think it would have
character a
taken
little
over
bit.
the character.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think you're right. Yeah,
Yeah,
Crudup
but
is fantastic in the role.
he's
really
great. There was a point where I think Billy Crudup was really one of those like subtle actors to really look out for. I mean, 3 years later, he would be in Big Fish, which is, at least for you and I, top 3 Tim Burton, if not
Yeah.
number 1 Tim Burton for some of us, maybe.
Yeah,
He was really good at that type of, I don't want to call it stoicism, but maybe I do want to call it stoicism. There was something about the way he conveyed stoicism that actually felt like it was screaming at you. And this is a great way to channel that through a rock star, the lead guitarist of a 70s rock band. And a lot of the songs here are really kind of good. You know, they're believable that they would come from a 1970s band, you know, more like a low rent 1970s band. This band was certainly not at the level of Led Zeppelin or David Bowie or the Allman Brothers Band, as the movie sort of talks about. But it's believable to come from that time. It doesn't feel watered down.
Fever
I
Dog
thought
rules.
it's a
Love
good
it.
kind of psychedelic hard rock tune. It really is.
Yeah, I'm a fan.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I dig it. I dig it. And some of these songs were actually co-written by I think Mike McCready from Pearl Jam was involved with it. I think he plays a lot of the guitar parts for them. And Cameron Crowe is known for also being a huge fan of the 1990s grunge scene. I mean, it was basically the backdrop for his film Singles, and he even did a documentary on Pearl Jam sometime later called Pearl Jam 20. So he's no stranger to that either. I love that you can get a filmmaker like this that acknowledges both worlds of rock and roll, because there is such a disparity between 1970s rock and 1990s rock. Sometimes there's almost like this feud between the two. And here is Cameron Crowe to say music's music, man. It's just good music, regardless of what the agenda is. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I do as well. And I do want to speak to the music here in a moment as my final thought, but to speak to what you were talking about there a moment ago with Phelan, I think another reason why I simply fall under the guise of historical context is that I think you can say the same thing about several other characters here. Anna Paquin, who I adore, is only in the film in a few scenes. Rainn Wilson has one brief appearance. Hiccup himself has 2 scenes in this film. Jay Baruchel is in the movie for
That was
very
so
brief
weird
moment of
seeing him
time.
in this. He's
Yeah.
such a baby.
He's so young. He's so young in this film. Mark Maron has a cameo. Mitch Hedberg has a cameo as well.
Yeah.
And if you're familiar with those guys, it is recognizable. You see it, you understand it. And as a film in the early 2000s and understanding where those specific individuals were in their career, I could understand why Crowe would hire them for these specific roles. But that to me is just part of the fun of doing these retrospectives and going back and watching them and seeing who's in what and what they looked like back then, what their performances were like. So yeah, I guess I just didn't have a problem with it because of that.
Well, the historical ramifications of it
yes.
is really,
Yeah.
I get you.
As far as the music goes, we talked about the implementation of it, how it's interwoven with the imagery, I think is fantastic. And also the audio itself, the weaving of diegetic and non-diegetic in this film is really imaginative. It's complementary to the images. And we see it early on. I noted earlier the Zoe Deschanel character, and maybe that's another one. She has 2 scenes in this film, 2.5,
and she is,
I guess.
Yeah, it almost feels like the origin story for New Girl.
It could be in a lot of ways. But, Anita has those scenes early on where she clearly doesn't get along with her mom. And it's very much this, like she conveys this ethos that art can express things about our lives that we cannot, that we as human beings struggle to articulate, but art can do that. And that's why she is leaving home. And she brings up one of the songs specifically. She tells her mom, listen to this song. And of course,
I think it was Simon and Garfunkel, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. And Elaine doesn't want anything to do with it, but the next
they're on drugs.
They're on drugs.
The poeticism of Simon and Garfunkel. They're on drugs. I love it.
Which is great irony, right? Considering Elaine and how she feels about drugs.
Yeah.
Don't do drugs, she says to William as he walks away, and all of the teenagers are
quotable
like,
line.
Mom,
Quotable
thanks,
line.
Mom.
Yeah.
So good. But yeah, as Anita is preparing to leave home, what does Crowe play over those images is that song, that Simon and Garfunkel song. Like, I love that in this film. Or I can't believe it took us this long to really talk about it. The Tyner Dancer scene in this film, which has become somewhat iconic with this movie, is such a blistering moment here. And you just can't help but smile and love when they start singing. And it starts off as this non-diegetic moment that becomes diegetic.
That's what I was just going to say. Well, that's what I was going to ask. Like, is it really diegetic? Because I do wonder, are they actually hearing the song played through the bus? Or do they just happen to be singing along to it because they felt the urge to sing it? I wonder, it's one of the greatest fusions of how song placement or music in general can serve as both a diegetic and non-diegetic purpose. It straddles the line so interestingly. Like, that's a scene that would be studied in film classes on that very topic.
Yeah, I completely agree. Just fantastic editing. Just love the implementation of all of that. So,
and I do want to correct myself earlier regarding the songs from Stillwater. Most of them were co-written by both Cameron Crowe and Nancy Wilson, with Peter Frampton writing, I think, 2 of them. He was also a technical music consultant on the film. Mike McCready from Pearl Jam played lead guitar on the songs, but didn't necessarily write the songs. So I just wanted to give proper credit where credit is due.
Well, there you go. I love this movie. It is one of my favorite films of 2000. And Cameron Crowe's best to date for sure. Absolutely love it.
What do you think of his filmography in general? I know that people tend to think he fell off the bandwagon a bit post Almost Famous, but I think he still did some pretty interesting films after this one.
Yeah, I mean, Vanilla Sky has its moments. I do like the film on the whole. It's certainly lesser Cameron Crowe. especially coming off the heels of Almost Famous and Jerry Maguire and Say Anything in 1989. It is a little bit of a letdown, but I do like it. There are moments of Elizabethtown that I like okay as well. There is a lot about his post Almost Famous career that it's a little disappointing that he was never able to get back to those same heights. And then we haven't seen anything from him in about 10 years at this point.
Yeah, at least
like Aloha
movie-wise.
broke him.
Yeah,
Like,
I mean, at least, yeah, cinematically, because I know he was a creator and directed the pilot episode for a show called Roadies, which I think only lasted for one season. Aloha, I think, really is his only major misstep as a filmmaker. I would say I think that's his only quote-unquote bad movie. Vanilla Sky is at least interesting. Elizabethtown, I think I at least appreciate mostly by association. I don't know if you feel the same way, JD, but we both lived in Kentucky for a while. So I think some of the Kentucky-isms kind of saved that movie for me in a way.
I agree.
And We Bought a Zoo, that's a film that works more for me if I simply choose to see it as, okay, this is a cute kids movie. That's really all it is. And if I see it as that, I find myself agreeing with it a little bit more. But there is, you're right though, that the films of Cameron Crowe post Almost Famous, they don't reach the heights of the films that came before it, where nearly everything was probably like a 4.5 out of 5-star rating on Letterboxd, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I can recognize that Vanilla Sky has some sort of, at least funneled through the prism of Cameron Crowe, like an ambition to it. Like I can see why he wanted to make that movie. It does feel like a Crowe movie to me in many regards. The rest of them, they don't feel inspired to me as much as like the work he did before. Like, I don't know if he needed a paycheck or how those films came about. I don't really know, but it does feel as if the creative juices just weren't there for those movies for whatever reason. I don't know. And then he's disappeared since 2015. So at least on the film side.
On the film side, he has, because like I mentioned, the show Roadies, but apparently Cameron Crowe is occasionally still writing for Rolling Stone. So there will still be a few articles, which maybe Almost Famous has kind of become full circle now that he's finding himself more like William Miller than
maybe he's
than
doing more
else.
music stuff these days. I really don't know. So, but I like his stuff up until Vanilla Sky. I really do love, like truly love it, and would love to see him get back to that at some point on the film side.
Yeah,
if
but I do think
has the inspired creative juices there. So
I do think Almost Famous is his best film, though.
Yeah, it's fan-freaking-tastic for sure. With all of that said, if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, please leave a comment below if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, reach out to us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com. Brendan, any final thoughts as we get out of here for this episode?
I mean, I feel like for this episode, I should have brought the bass guitar out and started jamming along to some Stillwater songs. I feel like that only would have been appropriate. I've been itching to play some bass during one of our podcast episodes. I missed the opportunity to do it now. I need the right interface for it. I only have one XLR channel to input into this thing. I need one that has two, so I can actually do both simultaneously. Maybe in the future. Maybe that's a future investment down the line.
Well, there you go. I wish I could play some Stillwater, but YouTube will take down the video, and we don't want that. So, unfortunately, I can't
some
take
Fever
us
Dog
out.
for you.
I want some Fever Dog. I would love that. But at any rate, I love this film. Stay tuned for our top 10 movies of 2000, episode 599, as we continue our 2000 retrospective before getting to best of the decade next week on 600. So with all of that said, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Oh, Lester Bangs. Philip Seymour
Be
Hoffman.
the dawn.
Do you take drugs?
Occasionally.